Good morning. Welcome to today's webinar on how to create a successful local content strategy. This is the second of 4 free webinars in our Responsible Extractives Webinar Series. Today we're going to be focusing on the challenges of developing local content in the resources industry. I'm lucky enough to be joined by Mel Case and Jeff Geipel, who will be sharing their experiences. So Melissa Case is the Community Relations Manager, currently based in Canada. Mel also served as the Community Relations Manager for Bechtel's Curtis Island LNG project, which is quite unique because they were 3 simultaneous construction programs at a single location. So we're going to hear a little bit about the creative strategies that she developed today. And then we've also got Jeff, who is the Mining Shared Value Venture Leader from Engineers Without Borders. And Jeff's done a lot of work in the mining industry, and he does a lot of work with companies you know, on numerous projects in the area of local content. Specifically, he's done some really interesting research recently, and you know, he's going to talk about how to report on local content too. So we've got lots going on. We've got live polling, so stay glued to the screen and share your thoughts. You can also put your questions and comments in using the box on the side as well. But without further ado, I'd like to welcome Mel and Jeff. And if we can start off with yourself, Mel, if you can just give a brief introduction to yourself, to the Curtis Island project, and highlight any sort of challenges or practical advice that you've got around local content on that case study.
Okay, good morning everyone, or afternoon or evening, wherever you are. So as was just said, I worked on the Curtis Island project in Gladstone, Australia, which is a simultaneous construction of 3 LNG projects. And we had a workforce of 14,500 people in a community of 35,000 people, so it was quite significant in terms of its presence in the community. And in terms of local content, I do believe that local content is critical, particularly to projects, regardless of their size or scale, because it allows people within the community to actually become part of the project. So whether they're gaining employment or whether they're actually supplying to the project, they can experience the project firsthand and also better understand the opportunities and challenges that companies face in terms of constructing these projects. So I think it's quite critical that local content is part of an important strategy on that.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you for that, Mel. That's a really good introduction. And Jeff, if I can come to yourself as well, just to give a very brief sort of introduction to yourself and share 1 or 2 of the different projects that you've worked on in this area as well.
So I lead a venture called Mining Shared Value with Engineers Without Borders Canada, and what we're trying to do is promote local procurement by the global mining industry in a very non-profit kind of pro-development way. And the way we do that is to work in three main ways. One is a resource, which is as much about us creating applied research on local content best practices and local content regulations as it is about compiling and distributing existing resources. And so, we look at case studies around the world and try to get them to companies so they can understand how this can be done. And the second role we play is to be a convener, which is about bringing together community of practice around this topic of local content. We find that there's not near as much in the way of sort of events and online forums around this topic as there is for other issues of responsible mining behavior. So we spend a lot of time, online working with the World Bank and also in person at events to bring together consultants, stakeholders, suppliers, and everybody. And then lastly, we work as a champion for the issue of local content, which means we promote local content inclusion in responsible mining standards, frameworks, governance standards, working with the OECD, a little bit with the African Mining Vision. And so it's essentially just trying to help all stakeholders with this issue and how they can better understand it. And some of the current projects we're working on, we're doing a research project with CERDI, it's called. It's a coalition of universities in Canada looking at local content regulations in sub-Saharan Africa. We're going to be looking at South Africa and Namibia and seeing, what's working, what's not working. We're doing a study supported by Cameco, who was on a previous Ethical Corporation webinar looking at best practices in procurement from Aboriginal business. And our newest project is working with GIZ, the German Development Agency, on creating a standard for local procurement reporting, trying to standardize how companies use the same metrics on that issue. So that's a little bit about us. I'm really happy to be part of this.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks a lot for that introduction as well. Okay, so we're going to go straight into our first poll because we do want to hear a lot more from the audience and what you are. So this is really just to gauge everyone's where everyone is on the webinar as well. So it's a very simple poll. It will be coming up on your screen first. It's very simply just, do you have a clear local content strategy? And we will go into a bit more detail about that once we've got the results. But this is from the mining and the industry professionals. If you could just select yes or no on your screen, then we'll display the answers in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so those answers are going to come up on your screen now. Now, overwhelmingly, it's pretty much a perfect split there as well. So we've got 2/3 of people are saying, actually, I don't have a clear local content strategy, and 1/3 do. So those of you at home, if you want to put in the chat bar a few different elements of what you think makes you need for a clear local content strategy, that would be great. But firstly, I'll come to yourself, Mel. In your experience, what sort of elements do you need in a local content strategy? And what are the challenges? Why do people not have a local content strategy? And what can they do to bring this together and make it more clear? So if we can, Mel, are you there? Can you hear me okay? Okay, Jeff, I might have to ask that same question to you, and we'll get Mel back shortly as well. So Jeff, yeah, lots of people saying that they don't have a clear local content strategy. Why do you think that is? And what do you think is needed to be able to create a successful, clear local content strategy?
Well, I mean, I think that the trend is towards having more and more local content policies for companies, and it's sort of in the last 5 years it's started to really pick up, and now I think it's just a matter of time before most companies do. In terms of actually implementing one and what's the most effective way, we really focus on suggesting to companies to make local content policies in coordination and partnership with local stakeholders. And a lot of companies will say to us, well, we don't have the knowledge or the money to do a local procurement program or to do a supplier development program. And we like to say that, look, it's not just you, it's the responsibility and interest of everybody to do this. So that means bringing in local banks and finance institutions, local chambers of commerce, even vocational schools. I mean, it's ultimately talking about development here, and so getting a lot of people on hand and drawing on those resources. I think a lot of in the short term, I think a really immediate thing that a local content strategy should focus on is an internal look at policies and procedures within the company and seeing are any of our procurement procedures actually disadvantaging local suppliers kind of unintentionally. So things like the structure of payment, when payment is made, particularly in underdeveloped countries, you might have a situation where the cash is a big issue for a local supplier, and so paying up front or paying very quickly is a way to bring in local suppliers who couldn't otherwise supply you. So kind of internal processes are probably a first step, and then I think the second step is to look at, what can we buy locally here if we do a little bit of supplier development? What's the barrier between a local supplier of cement to supplying us cement? What's the problem? Is it a technical problem? Is it a business skills problem? And I think it's about kind of doing a very, very in-depth analysis of local economic capabilities of the community and the surrounding economy, and making targets based on really empirical evidence and in partnership with local players.
Okay, brilliant. That's great. So to pull out a couple of points, it's getting people involved, not just the actual mining companies, but also looking at banks and finance and getting all players involved, and really drilling down to saying what is the problem and setting targets based on that. So that's really great. Thank you. Mel, I think you're back with us as well. I mean, this is sort of easily said and sometimes a little bit more tricky in terms of doing it. But how do you create a local content strategy for an industry that is very global? How do you take those big global processes in terms of project development, technology, and apply them on a local scale? What sort of tips do you have or thoughts on the webinar responses?
Okay, so as Jeff said, getting people involved is key to a successful strategy. So first of all, understanding your customer requirements. So they may have agreements as part of a social impact management plan or impact benefit agreement or whatever that agreement might be, or even with the government as well as part of their permitting requirements, that they might have a local content structure involved in that. So you need to first understand that, and then also understand the community capacity. So talking to local businesses, looking at various resources such as Chamber of Commerce, and understand what skills and what capacity there is out there in the community to help provide to the project. Also then looking at the gaps between the skills and capacity, and how those gaps can actually be filled. So is there additional training that needs to be undertaken? Is there additional funding that can be provided to build businesses up? What kind of strategies can you put in place to help build that capacity as well? Because at the end of the day, local content's just not a nice thing to do. It's actually the right thing to do, because it helps, as I said earlier, the community understand the project because they're actually part of it. And the thing, I guess, that most businesses need to be made aware of is, particularly with construction, is you don't have to be part of the main construction efforts to actually be a supplier to a major project. There's actually quite a lot of indirect benefits as well. So when I say indirect, I'm talking about things that don't necessarily construct the project physically, but they actually support the construction of the project. So things like cleaning services, food supply, transportation, logistics, those type of things. There's lots of opportunities there as well. So that local businesses will not normally have the capacity to do a multi-billion-dollar contract, but those smaller pieces, they can definitely pick up a couple of those. So it's about that process of working with the community so that they understand what the opportunities are.
Okay, fantastic. And I think around those indirect benefits, we might come back to that a little bit later when we're talking in a bit more detail about stakeholder engagement, because there might be some challenges around recording that and sort of measuring those tangible benefits as well. So that's fantastic. That's great. I know that we never get much time on these questions, so I'm going to go into the next two polls. So we're going to have one poll after the other as well. The first one is on what's happening. So we're really looking at the trends. What's happening to local content requirements. So that should be coming up on your screen now. do you feel the local content requirements from policymakers and that kind of thing, do you feel that they are too high to manage successfully? Do you feel it's okay, they're fairly manageable? Or do you think actually there's more that we can done, that we can be doing in this area as well? And do you think they're actually a little bit too low? So this is open to everyone, whether you're from the extractives industry, you know, outside, whether you're a policymaker yourself. Be really good to get your feedback on that as well. So those will be available on your screen in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, perfect. So that we're going to show that as well. Interestingly enough, a lot of people aren't saying that they are becoming too high. So we'll come back to that question in a second. We're going to go straight on to the next poll, and we'll make a note of those as well. But the next question is, do you think that these are going to increase, decrease, or remain the same? So we're kind of bringing our crystal balls out a little bit now, but looking at the future, are these only going to get higher with things that are happening in this industry around commodity prices, you know, obviously falling? Do you think that this is going to become more of a requirement or less? And we're going to show those results in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. So those will be coming up on your screen as well. Again, you know, really good, clear results from this as well. So just to recap, a lot of people are saying actually, you know, if anything, local content requirements are too low. There's a lot more that can be done in this area. So it'd be good to hear some thoughts about that. But they are also saying that, you know, this is something that's definitely going to increase. So Jeff, if I just come to yourself first, if you can give your thoughts on why you think it's increasing, and why you feel like more can be done, you know, what's causing that, and just give your thoughts on those sort of trends and what companies can do to prepare themselves for an increase in local content requirements. That would be great.
I mean, I think it's definitely, they're going to be increasing. They have been increasing. I think the trend has been for maybe about 10 years when it really started getting going, kind of on two fronts. One on African mining codes with the African Mining Vision in 2008, 2009 when that was released, and that was very heavily focused on local content. And then in terms of Australia and Canada, local business development has been increasing as a component of impact benefit agreements and land access agreements. So that's sort of been the trend, even going back about a decade. But then, of course, the commodity price hit, and commodity price downturn hit. Now there's even more pressure, because the reality is that you know, countries in Africa, for example, now have little to show for mining because the commodity prices lower tax revenues, and so they've got to find some way to show benefits for their citizens from mining. And so you know, the trend was already started before, and now it's only going to increase so long as the commodity prices are low and royalties are low. Governments are going to be under increasing pressure to show more results. And then in terms of, you know, I guess just as a, you know, a suggestion to companies, I mean, I think it makes sense to get ahead of this, because they're going to come, and it's sort of, if companies can spend their time, you know, doing a really good assessment of what's going on, you know, what they could supply, what they can't supply, or what they can't purchase locally, what they can supply, you know, they can actually negotiate with the government better to make realistic, you know, programs that will help everybody. Because the last thing we want is sort of arbitrary targets that don't make any sense to you know, for companies. So my suggestion is, yeah, get companies to get on board and be proactive on this issue.
Okay, brilliant. That's great. Thanks, Jeff. And Mel, if I can come to yourself as well, perhaps you can give your thoughts on, you know, if there's anything you want to add on why these requirements are increasing. But particularly around, we've mentioned in the past about how do you assess the capacity as well. What does that actually look like in terms of what you're doing on the ground? And And also, with regard to the increase in requirements, what are they going to look like? Is it going to be more prescriptive style of requirements? So you must you must procure 80% to a project, or is it going to be more incentive-based as well? And which one might work? What might be more effective?
Okay, so I think the poll was interesting because I think that I would agree that there's always more that can be done in terms of local content. Community expectations are always evolving, as we all know, with projects, and we are seeing definitely a greater increase in expectations of local content through supply and employment. In particular, the Curtis Island projects are interesting because they were the first projects within Australia to have a social impact management plan as a regulatory requirement. So along with that came with a variety of expectations from the government to manage the social impacts of the project. And it was really interesting because local content came very much into that as well. And there was a lot of reporting to the government that was required around local government. So we'll obviously talk about that later in the next part. But communities as part of the social license expect to have greater benefits from development and major resources in their community. It's an emerging trend that's kind of been happening for some time, I would say, and Jeff would probably agree with this, but I think that more and more it's becoming increasingly an expectation, particularly in Australia and Canada. In the past, people were just accepting and happy that they had some sort of development in their area, but now they expect that there's some return for having that presence there. So in terms of assessing capacity of local businesses, I think that it's important that you do spend the time with local businesses, particularly when you're building mega projects, so that they can have an opportunity to talk about what they do, and then also work through ways that they might be able to assist, as I said before, whether it is a major contract or perhaps an indirect benefit. I think that sometimes with local content and particularly mega projects, communities will pick off a really big piece of a project that they may not necessarily have the capacity to do, but they see that it's of significant value, and so we need to be sure that we go through the paces with local suppliers, in particular, that they understand that if they are going to supply to a major company, that there are very big expectations in terms of ability to deliver the quality of work and safety and all those other requirements as well. So it needs to kind of be a two-way education process. So education process for the local supplier, so that they understand what the company's requirements are to be able to supply the project to ensure everyone's successful, but also an education process for the company in terms of learning more about the local businesses and how they can either, or look at opportunities perhaps to, joint venture or do some seed funding or some capacity building in some way, or even get some government assistance to help build their capacity. And I think moving forward, I'm not sure what the direction will be, but I would suggest that potentially, governments increasingly with resource development will probably be more prescriptive about local content, so they will probably set specific targets or ranges in terms of what companies are expected to contribute to when developing their projects. So something to keep our eye on.
Yeah, definitely, and a trend that's only going to keep continuing as well. Okay, that's fantastic. What we'll do is we'll go on to our final poll as well, which is around local content reporting and stakeholder engagement. There's been lots of questions coming in, so do keep putting those down. Many of them related to this area as well. So that poll will be coming on your screen. Then we'll get Mel and Jeff's feedback, and we will go. We'll be going into the question and answer after that as well. So we'll try and get through to those questions. But that's on your screen now. So if you can vote, we'll be showing that in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. So the question, which is, do you feel that you effectively report and communicate the contribution that you make to society from local content? Again, we've got quite a nice even split. We've got 33 and 67%. There are more than 3 people on this webinar as well, so it's pure luck that we've had some similar results there. But that's interesting. So this is obviously an area where we can improve a lot, particularly in relationships with governments as well. So Mel, if I come to yourself first, and then I'll come back to Jeff. You've done quite a lot of work. You've mentioned a lot of things that you've been doing around stakeholder engagement. Can you sort of highlight, 1 or 2 key tips that will really help people communicate and manage expectations, and then give your thoughts on challenges and other issues around actually, communicating and reporting on local content?
Okay, so communicating local content is really important, I think, because particularly with the construction mega projects, people want to understand, how it is actually benefiting their community. And reporting is always a challenge because you need to make sure that you have systems and processes set up right from the beginning. And the problem is that there's never a template or one-size-fits-all approach. You can, capture certain things, but each customer and each, project will have different reporting requirements, whether it be to the government or various other sources. So I think that you definitely need to have that reporting system set up from the beginning so that you can capture data. And I think also that it's important that you make sure that you capture all of the information that you can. I mean, one of the things that is always most challenging is, okay, you can count and calculate your contract awards and, your purchase orders, but quite often a significant spend is credit card purchases, and expenses like accommodation and things like that don't necessarily fall under a normal contract or purchase order. So I find that it's really important that you make sure that you capture all of that as well. And another thing that's not often captured, which is really important, is local wages. So being able to track the flow-on benefits of the investment of employing local people, because obviously if they're local people, then they're spending their wages within the local community, which therefore benefits the greater community as well. So, for example, on the Curtis Island project, we paid $1.5 billion in local wages during the construction of those projects. And people were really surprised when we reported that figure, and because they recognised that that money then had flowed through to the community by people doing the shopping and accessing those type of services. So I think that, that definitely the reporting and communication to the community is really important. And I think also, the first step of doing that is making sure that your community leadership understands what those figures are, because then they are empowered to be positive advocates for your presence in the community as well. So, they can be delivering your message of $1.5 billion in wages along with you as well. And I think that, in terms of communicating benefits about projects and also challenges, that you need to ensure that your community leadership also has access to those messages so that they can also share them as well, because sometimes it's kind of seen as a more, unbiased kind of approach to the communication process if they hear it from someone else other than the main company.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you for that. And I think that answers Deborah put in a question as well before about, do you feel that you should be sharing sharing your strategies, what you want to do, and have complete transparency with the local community, which you sort of mentioned there as well. Big focus on data collection as well, and I think important to get the balance right between how deep can you go where it's going to give you a benefit and help you refine your policy without just creating unnecessary work. Jeff, I'm going to turn to you on this as well. What are your thoughts around the results there as well? And if you can talk a little bit about the research that you've done in this area, and again, if you've got any practical tips for people who are dealing with this day in, day out, what would be the holy grail that you would advise people to sort of focus on in this area, and what does it actually look like in reality?
I think kind of echoing Mel, there's 2 points to the reporting, and one is an internal management system, because you can't manage what you don't measure. And so, I mean, it's really important that companies are tracking their spend, their hires, where that money is going. Is it going to the local community? Is it going to a nearby center? Because we've talked to companies who, before we were talking to them, weren't defining local, so they really had no idea, what their spend impact was, and that would have not been great for their stakeholder engagement. It would have been great for explaining to the local government what they're contributing. So I mean, I think it's really important for companies to manage it better by measuring. But on the external front, I mean, you got to think about this as, if you can be upfront about what you're doing and what you're spending and that kind of information, it empowers others around you to make decisions and perhaps tap into what you're trying to do. And so, an example of that would be, if you're in a mining cluster where there's, say, 5 mines in this, reasonably small geographic area, and you're all doing supplier development programs. Well, having 5 supplier development programs isn't exactly the smartest way about doing that. You probably should do some joint project where you might combine resources and do some joint monitoring, because it all costs money, right? And so if everybody's reporting, everybody can take a look at what's going on and make a better analysis of the programs that are being made and what could be done as well. So I think that's sort of the internal and the external purpose of that. And in terms of our research, what we've been tracking is sort of how the largest companies in the world report on local procurement. We started with just the top 40 Canadian companies, and then we ended up doing the top 40 in the world. And the good news is that reporting is definitely on the increase in a big way. So more companies are reporting their programs. More companies are starting to actually divulge how much spending is local and how much is international, and that's all very useful. And so we've seen this upsurge. And as I mentioned before, we're working with GIZ to make a standard now so that we can use some common metrics, because there's a global reporting initiative which has some indicators, but they're a little bit ambiguous as to what you need to report, and we want to make report information that actually is useful for people. We don't want to just have reporting for the sake of reporting. And so we're working with GIZ and the ICMM and other groups to kind of agree on what's the highest level of detail that's useful for all stakeholders to go ahead and empower communities and governments and the companies themselves to do better things. And I think that's the holy grail, of course, is we'd love to have companies talking more about kind of maybe some of the big spends they're working on so that locals can understand. You take a look at local communities, and they often kind of guess at what mining companies are going to buy. But it would be really useful for companies to let people know in some way what they're spending. They can't provide is that obviously competitive advantage piece, but if they're spending a large chunk of their money on one particular product, it's certainly helpful for the locals to know what that product is instead of guessing at which product they spend a lot of money on. So I think that's the kind of detail we're trying to push. And in the meantime, I would suggest if you look at our report, which I just tweeted out, you can take a look. But I think the short answer is look at sort of Anglo-American, Newmont. They're probably the best two. Rio Tinto is quite good as well. Kinross Gold. If you look at these companies, they really report in great detail what they're doing, what the results are, and I think that's in the short term is a very good model for companies to look at.
Fantastic, that's great. Thank you for that, Jeff, as well. And yeah, great that you mentioned Newmont there as well. From a reporting standpoint, you know, they're one of the early adopters of human rights reporting, along with you know, outside of the industry, sort of businesses like Unilever and ABN AMRO as well. So yeah, you know, that's really great. But yeah, we're going to go to a few questions now. First one is quite topical, and it relates back to that second poll where we said that requirements are only going to increase. Mel, if I can ask yourself first, how are companies going to handle those increased requirements for local content if there is a sort of reduction or trimming of staff in the commodity price downturn, which is sort of part of that cyclical nature? What's the best way to deal with that? And is this a positive thing? You know, adding more local content, is that going to help your margins, or are there other challenges you need to be aware of?
I think
oh, yeah, sorry.
Yep, sorry. My
No.
screen just went up. So I think moving forward, you know, it's always something that is, you know, on companies' minds. Is to, you know, how can we constantly work to improve local content in involvement in projects? Because obviously, you know, for example, local employers are always more cost effective because they actually live in the community, and same as local suppliers because they're in the community. So if you need something quickly, then, you know, you can get it straight away. It doesn't need to be flown in from somewhere else. I think I'm just going to switch it around a little bit maybe and talk about how communities need to also be more effective in working with large businesses, because I think one of the challenges of local content is that, you know, you do find that some companies who are local will charge a local tax, in inverted commas, because they're local. So therefore, they do believe that they should have a involvement in the project or the industry because they are local, and that comes at any price. So communities need to be aware that they need to also be cost competitive when bidding for major projects, so that it makes them on an equal paying level in terms of, you know, going outside of the local community. I think that's really important aspect for local businesses to understand. But I think moving forward, you know, with the lower cost, you know, the commodity prices, local content is always going to be a more cost-effective option. And I guess it comes down to companies probably needing to work harder to build the capacity of local businesses so that they do have the ability to supply to bigger projects. And it really depends on the project as well and the location. Obviously, depending on what country you're working in and what project you're in, it's going to be different. I mean, Gladstone, for example, was a highly industrialized town, so there was a lot of businesses there that had a lot of capacity that could actually, you know, be awarded major projects. But if you're in a smaller community, you know, then you'll have to work a little bit harder to perhaps establish joint ventures to help build capacity. And I think that potentially joint ventures are the way that local businesses may need to consider looking into, so that they partner themselves with bigger companies so that they're able to gain the experience and also the financial backing and everything else that they need to take on those bigger contracts.
Great, thank you. That's great. Thank you for that, Melissa. And Jeff, if I come to yourself as well, what are your thoughts on things that we can do around this commodity downturn to really make sure that your local content strategy is effective, successful, and actually generates business business success, really?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a big challenge because we've been working on this issue now for about 3.5 years, and of course it's coincided exactly with this downturn, and so it's certainly hard to go up to a company now and tell them to do more things and more initiatives. So it's certainly a big challenge, and it's quite it can be frustrating because we'll actually talk to companies who know that doing local content and doing a supplier development program will actually save money, but it won't save money this quarter or next quarter. And that makes it very difficult for really, companies under siege, so to speak, right now to justify to their shareholders about spending more money on supplier development programs. Even if in the long term it saves money, so it's quite a perverse incentive we have right now. And so, I mean, I think the solution I think is to there is an element of weathering the storm. Because if you don't have local suppliers, and some of these local suppliers go under because you're not buying locally, them not being around is going to cost you more money down the road in terms of increased delivery times and less supplier options. So there's definitely a business case for buying locally, costing more in the short term. But I think the more important point I think is that you've got to be drawing on the skills, resources, and the competencies of people in the community and the host economy. And there's so many actors right now who have an interest in local suppliers doing well that will chip in money, will chip in resources. Anglo American has done some really amazing stuff in Brazil with working with banks, because essentially the banks needed the same information as Anglo American did in terms of supplier development, and so the banks stand to make money off suppliers doing well. So Anglo American worked with the banks to help get a lot of these suppliers financed, and that didn't really cost much to Anglo American. It probably to start off it did, but now it's actually yielding quite a lot of benefits and cost savings for Anglo American. So I think it's about really being creative with who you can talk to. You can think about having a steering committee, some sort of local content committee where you brought in a local finance institution, a local supplier or association, a chamber of commerce, maybe even a local university, and sort of get people in the room and start brainstorming ideas of how we could get a supplier development program going. And then you talk about the aid agencies. There's a lot of movement on this. There's so much talk about harnessing the private sector for development, and all the aid agencies are working in this space. And so I think there's money out there for supplier development programs. USAID is funding groups around the oil and mining sectors to do supplier development, and DFID is doing that in Zambia. So there's lots of opportunities, and I think it's about being creative with who you can work with.
Okay, brilliant. That's great. Thank you. I'm going to jump straight back into the next question. And this is looking at the difference between mining companies and oil and gas companies as well. So Jeff, because you're quite focused on mining, I'll come to yourself first just to say, what you think is specific about the mining industry when it comes to the contributions that they can make to society. If you've got any thoughts on how that's different to other industries, that would be great. And then I'll ask the same from yourself as well, Mel. But yeah, Jeff, what is it that's so different about the mining industry, and what do you need to be aware of?
Well, I mean, mining is a big hole in someone's backyard, so that necessitates a lot more proactivity around helping people get benefits. And I think the difference, there's a couple of key differences. One, of course, is that a lot of the oil is offshore, and that makes it very difficult to do local content. There's some structural things with laws and how oil lease agreements are done. But I think it's the mix of products that go into these mines. And a big open pit mine, there's a lot of cement needed. Some of the processing requires cement, tires. There's just a lot of stuff that can be done locally. Maybe not the Caterpillar trucks and some of the really high-tech stuff, but certainly things like filters and ball bearings and grinding media. A lot of these are really heavy consumables, chemical inputs These are all things that are realistically made locally in a lot of these countries. Even really developing countries, you can find some things that can be done. So I think that's kind of the key difference. I think there's a bit more opportunity in the mining sector. That being said, I think the other difference, though, which is quite interesting, is that because the oil sector is so concentrated in such large companies, some of the large companies actually have more done on this topic because they have more resources, right? So if you look at companies like Shell, they actually have a local content sort of specialist in the team, whereas most mining companies aren't quite big enough to actually have dedicated staff only to local content. So that's kind of it's a bit of an interesting paradox there, because I actually think the opportunities are better in mining, but because of the structure of the industry, it makes it a bit more difficult, particularly now when you see mining companies cutting staff and you'll have one CSR manager doing everything from economic impacts to the environment to health and safety. So, you know, we try to make it easy for them with the resources we create.
Okay, brilliant. And Mel, if we unmute yourself as well, you know, Bechtel are a construction company. You know, you work with anything from kind of transport all the way to sort of oil and gas. What do you think is unique about oil and gas? What was so unique about Curtis Island and you know, pulling together with other people? And what sort of yeah, what should people be aware of in oil and gas, and how is that different to mining?
Okay, so I think in terms of oil and gas, particularly in Australia, there was a significant skills shortage in terms of people that actually had experience in working in the oil and gas industry. So that was definitely a big challenge that we had to manage. I think also in mining, I actually came from a mining background previous to oil and gas, and there is, I guess, different perceptions around the impact of oil and gas industry as opposed to resource industry. You know, as Jeff said, you know, mining's a big hole in your backyard. Oil and gas, in terms of the facilities, is seen as, you know, a kind of a low impact thing to have in your community, but of course there's the upstream elements of that, which has, you know, a fair bit of community concern. But in terms of the difference between the two, I think that there's a lot of similarities between resource development and gas. I guess depending on the resource development, it can actually be, you know, contained into, you know, a certain area. But with the oil and gas industry, you know, particularly Curtis Island, you had, you know, 550 kilometres of pipeline that the community had to be involved in, as well as the actual facility in Gladstone. So in terms of footprint, there's a lot more effort required to ensure that adequate benefits and adequate coverage and adequate engagement and communications happens across that whole footprint. So yeah, it's not just about the operation, it's actually about, you know, where the product is coming from as well. And I know that the developers of the LNG projects in Gladstone, you know, worked really hard throughout that whole pipeline footprint to make sure that local businesses were involved in the project as much as possible, and particularly local contractors working on the development of that piece, and also local employment. So I guess the main difference is probably the footprint and the level of work that needs to go into making sure that your strategy goes across the whole project footprint.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. That's really, you know, two really interesting points there as well. Just to pick up on the perception there as well, not just perception on impact, but, you know, perception is something that has a huge influence on your social license to operate. But what about perceptions of what is local? So local to a policymaker might be on a country level in terms of what you need to do to sort of get that box ticked and you know, behave by the rules, so to speak. But how do you, is there any science towards how you define what is local from a kind of society perspective, so so that you're kind of mitigating those issues of lots of people coming into these towns from the capital or from other areas and being seen as taking jobs there, and having all of the issues that come along with mass migration towards a project. Mel, if I can come to yourself first and then Jeff, do you think there's a science to defining that, and how would you overcome those issues of kind of migration and expectations from a project?
So, yeah, defining what is local and also managing immigration is always a challenge, because particularly in migration, because you're not necessarily as a company able to control that, because people will come for the work and come to a community with an expectation that they will be able to gain work. So how do you actually make sure that when you're employing local people, you know, they are the local people and not just someone who's kind of, you know, turned up and booked into a motel and told you they're local? So, I mean, we make sure that we have systems and processes in place. Generally speaking, as part of the environmental assessment phase, there will be some sort of definition of local, which will be something that we would use as guidance. And it completely changes depending on the project location as well. For example, a project we're doing in the Middle East, specifically local is considered 2 towns where there's an expectation that the government has that, you know, majority of people and also businesses will, you know, come from those 2 towns in particular. And, you know, generally speaking, it needs to be a fairly even spread. Obviously, Prince Rupert, for example, you have Port Edward and Prince Rupert because they're the 2 small communities here, and you also have other communities on the outlying edges as well, which are considered local. In Gladstone, you know, it was very specifically set by the government that it was within a 60-kilometre radius. So some areas which were actually considered local to the local people and also to the local government were not actually considered local in terms of the government requirements. So that meant that people who were, say, an hour and a half's drive away, you know, needed to be provided with accommodation and treated as a non-local, and also reported as a non-local business, which is really interesting. So yeah, it's largely driven by the requirements of whatever the agreement is with the government for the development. But I think that you know, it's really important that, you know, you have a strategy around, you know, local first and then regional. So whereas in the Gladstone context, you know, the surrounding communities of Gladstone are actually regional, and then state or province, and then national, and then finally international. So generally speaking, that's the way that we will always work in terms of what our priorities are. So we'll always look local. If we can't find what we need locally, then we'll go regionally. If we can't find it regionally, then we'll go into the province or the state, and then outside into the broader circles.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you for that, Mel. Now we've only got about 5 minutes left. So, Jeff, I'm going to come to you. If you've got anything to add on that question about what is local and any kind of tips or techniques that you've got on that, that would be great. And then if you can add on to that, just a brief summary in terms of what are the main elements that are needed for a successful local content strategy, practical ways that you can develop the skills and knowledge, and how to form agreements and what mechanisms look like that are good for business and the local economy. And then we'll go over to Melissa just to have her final thoughts on those points as well. But Jeff, you first.
Great. I actually just tweeted out a guide from the IFC, Engineers Against Poverty. They've got a pretty, they've got a good start to how you can define local, and I think that's a good place to look at. But I think overall the key is to make the definition of local with your local stakeholders. It needs to be. It's not a science of saying what is the definition of local that works everywhere. It's actually about working with local stakeholders to make an effective definition of local that actually contributes to development. And so that's kind of what we recommend. I mean, it's a bit of a tension because, of course, sometimes the local is what people care about, the companies care about for stakeholder engagement. But sometimes local isn't actually the location that can actually do some of the biggest supplying. So it's a bit of a tension there of always, not being just about risk mitigation. There's definitely an element of how can we make development happen. And so sort of, and then in terms of summarizing what makes a good local content strategy for a company or for anybody for that matter, I sort of beat a dead horse, but it's all about multi-stakeholder engagement, working with local groups to draw out the competencies and skills and resources. I think that's the most important part, and making it so the company is not seen as this can't be a company-led process. It's got to be a completely multi-stakeholder-led process with local ownership and local accountability, so that people are looking at not just the company for buying locally, but actually also the local government, local economic planners as responsible for this process.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. And Melissa, if I can just go to you, because we've got about 2 or 3 minutes left. Did you have anything to add around those areas? So what main elements, what are the main elements of a successful local content strategy? And any real practical advice in terms of how to address the skills gap, and how to form mechanisms or agreement that are good both for the company themselves and for the local economy. Do you have any sort of leaving thoughts on that? Mel, are you there? Okay. I mean, I guess just to summarize.
Sorry, I'm here.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, go for it, Mel.
I completely agree that you need to have the community involved in the process, particularly in the development of your plan. It's just a key part of your success. A couple of tips I've got is, data collection is only as good as the data that you're actually putting in. So you can have the best system in the world, but make sure that you're actually putting in meaningful data. And also, what metrics work for you in data collection. So don't make it an onerous process, and make sure that everything you collect is actually going to be useful to you during your project. And invest that time to work with the local community so that they understand the opportunities and challenges, because that will help you gain, community trust and also social license to operate. And also my last tip would be, there's some fantastic examples out there, so do some research and look at the components of other elements of plans that will, work for your business to develop your own plan.
Okay, that's fantastic. I can't sum it up any better than that, Mel. So all that I have to do is thank you both for those contributions. I hope that everyone who's been listening in found some value to that. We will be writing up some notes on this, doing a proper analysis and everything that's discussed, and sending through this along with the recordings afterwards as well. So we'll try and address some of the questions that we haven't had the time to get round to. As well, in June, we do have the 7th annual Responsible Extractives Summit happening in London, where we've got 2 days where we can really go into detail about these issues, because sometimes an hour isn't quite long enough. But other than that, thank you so much to everyone. I hope that you enjoyed it, and we'll be back next month with a little bit of a perspective from the investor community on environmental and social governance in mining. So we'll keep you updated with that. And yeah, thanks very much. Bye.